Caldwell, Kansas, September 1879. The sun came up slow over the Kansas plain the way it always did in September, with a pale, considered light that had no warmth in it yet, and the boardwalk of Main Street was empty except for one woman setting out bread. She worked without hurry. She unfolded the cloth, arranged the loaves by size, set the smaller spiced cakes toward the front where the smell would carry. She wore a gray dress that had been let out at the seams and taken in again and let out once more until the fabric had learned the shape of hard years. Her hands were flour-dusted and steady. Her back was straight. It had always been straight, even now, especially now. Her name was Josephine Marsh. Most people in Caldwell called her Jo, which was a name she had answered to since girlhood and which suited her better than the longer version being shorter and harder and less easy to condescend to. She was 32 years old. She had once set the finest table in 3 counties. She had once owned a pantry that was spoken of at other women's dinner parties as a kind of local legend. She had once been the wife of Edmund Marsh, whose name on a contract was considered as good as a bank seal from Wichita to the Colorado line. That had been 2.5 years ago, before the partner, before the books. She did not think about it on mornings like this. She had trained herself not to. She set out her bread, and she waited for the town to wake up, and she kept her back straight because it was the one thing no one had found a way to take from her, and she intended to keep it. The first customer of the morning was a woman named Adeline Pruitt, who had come to Joe's Sunday dinners 6 times in the good years, and who now approached the breadbasket with the careful sympathy of someone visiting the sick. She bought a loaf. Then she pressed an extra coin into Joe's hand with a soft, pitying squeeze. Joe looked at the coin. She looked at Adeline Pruitt's face, which was arranged in the particular expression of a woman doing a charitable thing and hoping to be credited for it. Joe held the coin out. "You've overpaid by 5 cents, Mrs. Pruitt." "Oh, I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant." Joe's voice was pleasant and entirely level. "The loaf is 15 cents. That's what it costs. I'd not have us both confused about what's happening here." Adeline Pruitt took her coin back with the stunned expression of someone whose generosity had been returned without ceremony and walked away quickly. Joe turned back to her bread. 2 blocks down on the left side of Main Street, the sign above the door of Webb and Associates Land and Commerce caught the early light and threw it back without apology. She did not look at it. She never looked at it. That was the arrangement she had made with herself, and she kept it the way she kept all her arrangements with herself, which was absolutely and without exception, because she had learned that the small disciplines were what held the larger ones together, and if she let one go, she would have to reconsider them all. But she knew it was there. She always knew it was there. The sign was 2 blocks behind her left shoulder every morning she stood on that boardwalk. It had been there for 2 years. It would probably be there for 20 more. Because the man whose name was on it was not the kind of man the world inconvenienced without a great deal of pressure being applied from directions he could not anticipate, and so far no such pressure had materialized. She arranged her spiced cakes and waited for the next customer. And the morning went on the way mornings went on in Caldwell in September, slow and brightening with the smell of dust and coming autumn in the air. His name had been Edmund Marsh, and he had been the best man Josephine had ever known, which was not a sentimental judgment but a practical one arrived at after 32 years of observing human beings at close range and noting the difference between what they said about themselves and what they actually did when things got difficult. Edmund did what he said. That was the whole of it. He ran the largest mercantile and freight concern in Caldwell. He paid his workers on time and in full. He shook hands and meant it. He came home for supper every evening except the 2 times a year he made the buying trip to Wichita, and on those nights he wrote to Joe from the hotel. Not long letters. Edmund was not a letter writer, but short ones that said what he meant, which was more than most men managed in a lifetime of talking. He had trusted Hargrove Webb because Webb had a smooth way about him and figures that looked solid on paper, and because Edmund was the kind of man who believed that the face a man showed you was the face he had, which was a fine way to be and a dangerous one, and which had cost him everything. Webb had come in as a partner 18 months into what looked like the most profitable period the concern had ever seen. He had brought capital and connections and a manner that made bankers feel at ease. And Edmund, who understood freight and supply lines and the practical mechanics of commerce, but who had never fully trusted his own instincts about people, had welcomed him the way a man welcomes rain after a dry summer. For 2 years, Webb had been impeccable. The books were clean. The profits were real. The handshakes were firm. And underneath all of it, in a second set of numbers that Edmund was too decent to suspect existed, Webb had been drawing the concern dry with the patient, methodical efficiency of a man who had done this before, and knew exactly how long it took before the bottom showed. Edmund found out on a Tuesday in March of 1877. Joe had known something was wrong the night before. Edmund had come home late and eaten nothing, and sat at the table where she had served 100 dinners, looking at his hands, and she had sat across from him and not asked, because she had learned in 12 years of marriage that Edmund would tell her when he was ready and not a moment before, and that pressing him only made the silence longer. He told her the next morning before she had the coffee made. He told her about the books, about the second set, about the amount which was significant enough that the word significant felt like entirely the wrong word. He told her about the conversation with the bank, which had gone badly. He told her about the options, which had gone worse. And then he stopped talking and sat down at the kitchen table in his coat because he had not taken it off yet. And Joe had stood at the stove looking at the back of his head and understood that the table they were sitting at and the stove she was standing at and the house around them were already gone in every way that mattered, and the paperwork was simply waiting to confirm it. Edmund Marsh died 2 weeks later. He died in the back room of the store that was already in the process of being handed over to the creditors at his desk with his account books in front of him. The doctor said his heart had stopped. Joe had sat in the parlor of a house she would have to vacate in 30 days and received that information and said thank you to the doctor and seen him to the door, and then stood in the hallway for a long time, not thinking anything at all. The creditors had been thorough. They took the furniture and the inventory and the outstanding accounts and the warehouse and the freight contracts. They took the china and the silver and the dining table. They took the house. They left Joe Marsh widow, age 32, with a name that was worth considerably less than it had been a month prior, a complete working knowledge of how to feed a crowd, and 2 hands that had been raised to believe a lady never used. She used them. She found a corner of a kitchen to rent from a woman named Sutherland, who ran a boarding house on Elm Street. She baked what she knew bread pies, the small spiced cakes that had once anchored the dessert end of her Sunday dinners. She sold them from a basket on the boardwalk because the boardwalk had foot traffic and no overhead, and because standing still was not something she intended to do. Hargrove Webb was not in jail. This was a fact that required some getting used to, and Joe had spent the better part of 2.5 years getting used to it without notable success. Webb had not run. He had not hidden. He had, in the months following Edmund's death, reorganized his interests under a new company name, secured 3 new investors from Wichita and 1 from Denver, and established himself in a set of offices on Main Street with a sign in the window that read, Webb and Associates Land and Commerce, in letters that caught the light every morning at approximately 8:15. There had been talk of investigation. There had been a lawyer, briefly, who had taken Joe's case on the understanding that the evidence might support a claim of fraud. The evidence had not been organized in a way that supported such a claim because Edmund had trusted Webb with the books, and Webb had been very careful about what he left in the books to be found. The lawyer had returned her retainer with a letter of condolence that was more condolence than anything else, and the matter had closed. Joe had taken note of this. She had taken note of all of it, and she had put it in the same place she put everything she could not act on yet, which was a place with no name and no lock, in which she visited less and less as the work of surviving took up more and more of her attention. She kept her back straight. She sold her bread. She did not look at the sign. And then on a Saturday in the 3rd week of September, a big man with a sunburnt scowl stopped at her basket and changed the direction of everything, though neither of them knew it yet. Calhoun Briggs was not a man who stopped at bread baskets. He was a man who sent other men to buy what he needed, or who walked into a store and said what he wanted and paid without discussing it and left. He was 42 years old, and he had run the Briggs spread 4,000 acres of Kansas grassland, southeast of Caldwell, for nearly 20 years, and he had arrived at the particular station of a man who had been deferred to for so long that he had partially forgotten it was deference, and not simply the natural order of things. He was a widower of 11 years. His wife Margaret had died in the spring of their 3rd year of marriage in circumstances that Calhoun did not discuss, and that the county had long since agreed not to bring up in his presence. He had 12 hands working his spread. He had accounts with 2 banks and a reputation for paying in full and on time, and for being approximately as easy to work for as a January blizzard if the work was done sloppily or the truth was inconvenient. He had stopped at Joe's Basket because his cook had quit 4 days ago in a fury over a dispute about biscuit flour that Calhoun considered frivolous, and the cook had apparently considered a matter of professional principle, and his 12 hands had been eating whatever the youngest of them could manage to assemble from the provisions, which had produced results that were generating serious grievances among men who had few enough comforts to begin with. He bought a loaf. He tore the heel off and ate it standing there, and Joe watched him with the careful attention of a woman who had watched a great many people eat her bread and had learned to read the verdict before it was spoken. He chewed. He swallowed. He looked at her with a sunburnt squint that was his version of serious consideration. "You bake well," he said, the way a man might say a fence post was solid. It was the highest compliment he had available, and he delivered it as though it settled the matter entirely. "Thank you," Joe said. "My cook quit. I've got 12 hands about ready to string up the next person who hands them a cold biscuit. I'll take you on. Room of your own, full kitchen, fair wages. Better than standing out here selling to women who feel sorry for you." He reached for his wallet, the matter already concluded in his mind. "You can start Monday." He had already half turned away. Joe let the silence sit. It sat long enough that he turned back to find out why she hadn't thanked him. She was looking at him with an expression that was not hostile and not warm, and was entirely unintimidated, which was a combination of features he was not accustomed to finding on the faces of people he was in the middle of doing favors for. "I'll cook for your outfit, Mr. Briggs," she said. Her voice was pleasant. It went through him like a draft from under a door. "Your hands will not have cause to complain again. I promise you that. But you've made 2 mistakes in the space of 1 sentence, and I'd not have us start on a misunderstanding." He said nothing. He was recalibrating. "The first mistake is that you think you're rescuing me from women who feel sorry for me. You're not. Whatever they feel is their business to carry, not mine. I have managed this basket from a position of my own choosing, and I would manage it another 10 years before I'd take a wage from a man who thought he was doing me a kindness rather than hiring a cook." She let that land. "The second mistake is the word better. Better than standing out here. There is no better and worse in honest work, Mr. Briggs. There is only whether a thing is done well. I presided over Sunday dinners that this county still talks about, and circumstances saw fit to remove the table those dinners were served on. They did not remove the woman who set it, and they did not remove her capacity to determine the value of her own labor. The boardwalk was quiet around them. 2 men loading a wagon 20 feet away had found sudden urgent business with their harnesses. "Now, you may make me a proper offer plainly as to a tradesperson with a fair wage named and the word kindness nowhere in it, and I will consider it on its merits. Or you may put your wallet away and buy your bread like anyone else. Either suits me." Calhoun Briggs stood on the boardwalk of Caldwell, Kansas, with a heel of her bread in his fist, and looked at Josephine Marsh the way a man looks at something that has just behaved in a way that was not in any category of behavior he had prepared for. He had been deferred to by bankers, by county commissioners, by men twice his size who had sense enough to know which way a hard wind was blowing. He had not in longer than he could accurately recall been spoken to as a plain equal by someone who was entirely and completely unafraid of him. He found he did not know what to do with it. He found he did not want it to stop. He took his hat off. It was a significant gesture for a man who did not make gestures, and he made it without ceremony, which made it more significant. "Beg your pardon, Mrs. Marsh," he said. "I'll try that again." He named a wage that was fair and specific and had no charity in it. He described the kitchen, the provisions, the arrangement of meals, the bunkhouse for the hands, the room she would have to herself off the main kitchen. He said it plainly, one tradesperson to another the way she had asked, and when he was done, he put his hat back on and waited. Joe considered the offer for exactly as long as it deserved, which was 30 seconds of genuine evaluation. "I'll start Monday," she said. Calhoun nodded, once paid for the loaf and walked back to his horse without looking back, because he was not a man who looked back, and also because something was happening behind his sunburnt scowl that he did not entirely understand yet and which he preferred to examine in private. Joe watched him go. She straightened her cloth, adjusted the position of the remaining cakes, and served the next 3 customers with the same level attention she gave everything. But something had shifted in the particular quality of the morning in a way she could not have named and would not have tried to. She came out to the Briggs spread on Monday morning with 1 trunk and no expectations. The trunk held practical things, 3 changes of working clothes, a good apron and oilcloth, her mother's recipe book, which was the only thing the creditors had not been able to assign a value to and therefore had not taken. A small bundle of dried herbs she had grown in pots on the windowsill of the boarding house kitchen because she had learned that a cook who cannot season properly is only a woman heating food, and she refused to be only that. She did not bring sentiment. She did not bring hope exactly. She brought competence, which was the thing she trusted most because it had never yet failed to be enough. Calhoun Briggs met her at the gate on horseback, which she understood was not courtesy but efficiency. He was a man who combined errands. He nodded once, told her the kitchen was through the back door, told her the hands ate at 6 in the morning and noon and 6 in the evening, told her the provisions were in the larder, and whatever she needed that was not there she should write down and he would see it ordered. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward the south pasture without asking if she had any questions. She did not have any questions. She went through the back door and found the kitchen. It was a large room with good proportions and a wide iron range that had been well maintained, and a window that faced east, which meant morning light, which meant she could see what she was doing at the hour when seeing mattered most. The larder was deep and reasonably stocked. The knives needed sharpening. The flour barrel was nearly full. There was a smell in the room of long use and mediocre cooking of burned beans and salt pork and the particular resigned odor of a kitchen where no one had cared very much about what came out of it. She opened the window. Then she put on her apron, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work. By 6 o'clock that evening, the kitchen smelled different. She had made bread 2 large loaves and a batch of the smaller rolls. She knew from long experience that working men ate 3 of each when they could get them. She had made a beef stew from provisions that had been sitting long enough to need using cooked down with dried onion, and the last of a bunch of thyme she had found hanging near the door and seasoned with the particular careful attention she gave everything, which was not the attention of someone following instructions, but of someone who understood what food was for. She had made a dried apple pie because the apples were there and they were going to waste, and waste offended her in a way that was almost moral. The 12 hands came in from the day's work and sat down, and Joe set food in front of them. The silence that followed was the silence of men who had been eating badly for 4 days and had just been reminded what it felt like not to. She watched them eat from the kitchen doorway. She was not seeking approval. She was assessing the room the way she assessed every room she entered, identifying the weight and distribution of it, noting who sat where and who deferred to whom and where the tension was carried. The tension was carried primarily by a man named Tatum. He sat at the near end of the table, broad as a barn door, with a black-browed scowl that appeared to be his resting expression and a manner that occupied more space than his body strictly required. He had driven off the 2 cooks before her. He had done it, she suspected, not through outright hostility, but through the slow, grinding assertion of a man who needed to establish that no one in a room had authority over him. She had known men like Tatum her entire adult life. She had fed them at her Sunday dinners, and she had managed them across years of busy seasons, and she had learned that the only thing that worked with a man like Tatum was to be entirely, completely, and immediately unintimidated by him, because men like Tatum could smell hesitation across a room, and they moved toward it the way water moves toward low ground. She served them and watched them and said nothing that first evening, and she went to bed with a clear understanding of what the third morning would bring. She was right about the third morning. Tatum came in from the early feed still wearing his work from the night before mud to the knee and reached across the table for the bread before he had sat down or washed or acknowledged that anyone else in the room existed. Joe was at the range. She turned without haste. She crossed the kitchen. She brought the flat of her wooden spoon down across his outstretched wrist with a sharp, decisive crack, the way you would correct a boy who had not yet learned the rules of a civilized table. The room went absolutely still. Tatum was a man who had not been corrected by anyone in recent memory. He pulled his hand back and looked at it, and then he looked at Joe, who was standing beside him at her full height, which was not impressive in terms of inches, but was entirely impressive in terms of what was behind it, and she looked back at him with the face of a woman who had made a decision and was entirely comfortable waiting to find out what he was going to do about it. The 11 other men at the table did not breathe. Tatum looked at the spoon. He looked at Joe. He looked around the table at 11 men who were watching him with the careful neutrality of people who did not want to be involved, but could not look away. Then he stood up, walked out to the wash bench, scrubbed his hands and forearms to the elbow. Under the cold pump water, came back in, sat down, and ate 3 helpings of everything. He called her ma'am. He called her ma'am for the rest of the season and then for the rest of the year. And eventually he called her Mom, with the particular inflection of a man who has decided it is a title of genuine respect and not merely a habit, which is a different thing entirely and takes considerably longer to earn. The 11 other men watched what happened with Tatum and drew their conclusions, and from that morning forward, the Briggs spread ate like guests at a wedding. They scraped their boots at the door. They washed before meals unasked after the first week. The roughest of them took to finding reasons to pass through the kitchen in the hour before supper, drawn less by hunger than by the experience of being spoken to, with the expectation that they were capable of decent behavior, which several of them had not encountered in years. Joe fed them and managed them and kept the kitchen the way she had kept everything she had ever been responsible for, which was with exact and unsentimental competence, and she did not ask to be thanked for it and did not require the condition to change. She was there to work. She worked. The account books were not her business. She knew this. She had not been hired to look at account books. She had been hired to cook 3 meals a day for 12 men and to keep a kitchen. And those were the boundaries of what she had agreed to, and she intended to respect them, because she was a woman who believed that the terms of an agreement meant something and that exceeding them uninvited was its own form of dishonesty. But the books were on the kitchen table, not in an office, not in a drawer. On the kitchen table where someone had apparently been going over them before supper and had set them aside when supper was called and had not come back. They were open to a page of livestock tallies that she could see from the range, and she would have had to actively redirect her eyes to avoid reading the top line, and what she read on the top line did not match the rest of what she could see, and her mind, which had been trained across years of managing a commercial enterprise, to identify a discrepancy on a ledger page the way other people's minds identified a wrong note in a piece of music, had already registered it before she had made any conscious decision to look. She finished washing the supper dishes. She put the kitchen straight. She hung up her apron. Then she sat down at the table. She went through the livestock tallies for the current year first, then for the year before, with the careful attention of someone who has spent enough years keeping books to understand the difference between an error and a pattern. By 9 o'clock she had found what she was looking at. It was not an error. It was a pattern specific and consistent running back 9 months to January of 1879. A hand was selling Briggs cattle and recording the sales at below-market prices, pocketing the difference and adjusting the counts in the tally books with enough skill to pass casual inspection, but not enough to withstand the kind of attention Joe was currently giving them. The total calculated across 9 months of recorded transactions was significant. She sat with that for a moment. Then she tore a page from the back of her recipe book, which was the only paper she had to hand, and she wrote out the discrepancies in her clear, precise hand with the relevant dates and figures and the specific entries that did not reconcile, and she set the piece of paper on top of the open ledger and put the ledger on the corner of the table where it could be seen from the doorway, and she went to bed. She said nothing to Calhoun that morning. She said nothing the next morning either. On the third morning, she came into the kitchen to start the breakfast fire and found the ledger gone from the corner of the table and a new account book sitting in its place, still wrapped in the brown paper from the store. Beside it was an envelope with her name on it, and inside the envelope was a week's wages paid in advance, which was not the arrangement they had agreed on, and which she understood to be Calhoun Briggs' version of gratitude delivered in the only form he had available, which was a transaction rather than a sentiment, because transactions were what he trusted. She put the money in her apron pocket and made the breakfast. 2 days later, one of the 12 hands was gone. No explanation was offered to the crew, and none was asked for because 12 working men understood what it meant when a man disappeared quietly on a Tuesday morning with his bunk stripped and his saddle gone from the barn, and they drew their conclusions and moved on. That evening, Calhoun came into the kitchen after supper, which he did not ordinarily do, and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. "I'll need the books kept going forward," he said. "I'll pay you additional for it. Name what you think is fair." Jo was drying dishes. She considered the proposal without turning around. She named a figure that was fair and precise and had nothing apologetic about it. Calhoun accepted it without negotiation, which told her the figure was lower than he had expected, and she filed that information for future reference. They shook hands over it across the kitchen table, which was another thing she had insisted on from the beginning, because a handshake made it a business arrangement, and a business arrangement had terms that both parties understood, and terms that both parties understood were the only foundation she had ever found that held weight. The books of the Briggs spread ran clean from that day forward. It was the nearest thing to a declaration either of them had yet managed. The trouble with October was that it was beautiful, and beauty was distracting, and Jo could not afford to be distracted. The cottonwoods along the creek went yellow in the second week of the month, and the mornings came in cold and clean with a sky the color of good water, and the work of the spread settled into the particular productive rhythm of a ranch preparing for winter, which was steady and physical and deeply satisfying in the way that purposeful work always was. The kitchen was warm. The bread rose well in the cool air. She was not unhappy. This was something she noted with the same careful observational honesty she applied to account books. She had not been unhappy in a long time, and the sensation was unfamiliar enough that she did not entirely trust it yet, but it was there, persistent and specific, and she could not honestly deny it. Part of it was the work which was good work done well, and which she had always found sustaining in a way that other things were not. Part of it, and this was the part she was careful with, was the arguing. She and Calhoun Briggs argued about everything. It had begun with the apple trees. There were 6 apple trees along the south fence of the kitchen garden that had gone unpicked through the first half of October, while the apples ripened and fell and began to go soft in the grass, and Jo, who had been raised to believe that waste was a sin of a particular type, one that combined laziness with ingratitude in a combination she found aesthetically offensive, had made her opinion of this known to Calhoun over supper one evening in language that was restrained but not unclear. Calhoun had told her the men were occupied with the fall gather and could not be spared for apple picking. Jo had told him that apple picking required no specialized skill, that it could be done at any hour of the day, that soft apples made excellent butter, and dried apples lasted the winter, and that a man who left 6 trees' worth of fruit to rot on the ground because he could not organize 20 minutes of labor had no standing to complain about his provisions in February. Calhoun had told her she did not understand the demands of a working cattle operation. Jo had told him she understood waste when she saw it. They had argued for 40 minutes, and Jo had won, because she always won, and the apples had been picked the next morning by 3 hands working before the early feed. And Jo had put up 14 jars of apple butter and 2 bushels of dried rings before the week was out. The crew had eaten apple butter on their bread through the whole winter, and not one of them mentioned it, but not one of them left so much as a scraping in the jar either. The arguing continued. It moved from the apple trees to the management of an older horse that Calhoun intended to sell and Jo considered still serviceable and deserving of a better end. It moved from the horse to the question of whether Calhoun slept enough, which Jo raised not out of personal concern, she told herself, But because a man running a 4,000-acre operation on 5 hours of sleep was a liability to the operation, which was a logical argument and entirely true, and also not the complete reason she had raised it, Calhoun lost every argument. He also kept finding new things to argue about, which Joe noted without remarking on, because some information was more useful kept than shared. One evening in late October, Tatum found Calhoun standing in the kitchen door, watching Joe work for the third time that week. "You've been walking past that kitchen a lot lately, boss," Tatum said with the particular directness of a man who had been corrected with a wooden spoon and had developed a certain blunt appreciation for people who said what they meant. Calhoun did not answer. Tatum looked at him. Then he looked at the kitchen. Then he looked back at Calhoun with an expression that was for Tatum remarkably close to gentle. "That ain't a problem you've got," Tatum said quietly. "That's a woman you found." Calhoun walked away without responding, but he did not deny it. And Tatum, who was a man of few words and used them with care, let it stand at that. Mrs. Fenwick came to the Briggs spread on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, which was not a day she had been invited. Arriving in the buggy she used for what she called calls and what the county called her delivery route, because Mrs. Fenwick carried Caldwell's opinions from house to house, the way other people carried mail, with regularity and without much regard for whether the recipient had requested the delivery. She was a woman of 50-some years with an expression of permanent, pleasurable concern and a gift for framing interference as solicitude that was so well developed it had probably been genuine at some early point and had since become entirely automatic. Joe was rolling pie crust when she heard the buggy and came to the door. "Mrs. Marsh," Mrs. Fenwick said, settling herself in the kitchen doorway, with the air of a woman who had not been invited in and intended to manage the conversation before that fact became relevant. "I have been thinking of you. We all have. It is such a particular situation, a widow of your standing living out at a bachelor's ranch." She arranged her face into the configuration of deep, caring concern. "One does think of appearances, of what people are saying." Joe was rolling her crust. She did not stop. "And what are people saying, Mrs. Fenwick?" "Well," Mrs. Fenwick adjusted her gloves. "People are saying that it is very remarkable, that Mr. Briggs is very taken with the arrangement, that a woman in your circumstances might perhaps be wise to consider how such an arrangement appears to the community." Joe turned the crust a quarter rotation, applied even pressure from the center outward, and said, "My circumstances, Mrs. Fenwick, are that I am employed at a fair wage to perform skilled work in a professional capacity. I keep accounts and I keep a kitchen, and I am very good at both. If the community finds that remarkable, I expect the community will find something else to remark on by spring." She lifted the crust, draped it into the pan, with the easy competence of a woman who had done this 10,000 times, and looked up. "I made a dried apple pie this morning. You'll take one home. I make more than the crew can finish." Mrs. Fenwick accepted the pie with the slightly deflated expression of a woman whose campaign had been redirected into a transaction, and went away with nothing further to say, which was the unkindest possible outcome for a woman of her particular gifts. But Joe stood at the kitchen window after the buggy disappeared down the track and understood with the clear-eyed practicality that governed everything she did that Mrs. Fenwick's visit was not the end of something but the beginning of it. Mrs. Fenwick did not originate opinions. She carried them, and somewhere in Caldwell someone had sent her. Joe thought about who that someone might be and arrived after approximately 30 seconds of consideration at a name she had not yet encountered directly, but which she had been aware of, the way you are aware of weather coming from a direction you cannot yet see. Dorothea Ashworth, Margaret Briggs' older sister. The woman who had spent 11 years managing her dead sister's husband's social standing with the focused efficiency of a person who has found her purpose and intends to keep it. Joe turned back to her kitchen. Whatever was coming would come in its own time, and she would meet it the same way she met everything, which was standing upright and prepared. The invitation arrived on a Thursday in November. It came in an envelope of good cream paper, with Dorothea Ashworth's return address pressed in the upper left corner, addressed to Calhoun Briggs in a handwriting that was precise and controlled, and left no room for misinterpretation, which was the handwriting of a woman who did not leave room for misinterpretation in anything, Calhoun brought it in from the post and set it on the kitchen table without opening it, and stood looking at it the way a man looks at something he already knows the contents of and is deciding how much to dread. Jo was at the range. She did not look at the envelope. She turned the bread and checked the temperature and waited because she was a woman who understood that silence was sometimes the most honest thing you could offer a person. Dorothea's social, Calhoun said. December 14th. I know of it. She wants you to come. Jo turned from the range and looked at him. She read his face the way she read ledger pages, with complete and unsentimental attention. What she saw was not fear exactly. It was the specific unease of a man who understood that something was coming and could not yet see the full shape of it, but whose instincts were telling him it was not good. Does she? Jo said. She's Margaret's sister. She runs that gathering every year. If we don't go, it becomes a statement. And if we do go, it may also become a statement. Calhoun looked at her steadily. I can tell her we're busy. Jo turned back to the range. She was quiet for a long moment, and the fire ticked in the iron, and the bread filled the kitchen with the smell that kitchens ought to have. We'll go, she said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. Her voice was level and certain. I've spent 2.5 years in this town not going places because it was easier not to. I'm done with easier. She did not look at him when she said it, and he did not press her, and that was the end of the conversation. But later, when the midday meal was done, and the hands were back at their work, and the kitchen was quiet, Jo stood at the window looking out at the November grassland, going brown and flat under a gray sky, and she thought about Dorothea Ashworth's cream envelope and her precise handwriting, and she thought about the last time she had walked into a room full of Caldwell's finest and what that room had been to her. She had done harder things than walk into a parlor. She turned back to her work. November settled over the Briggs spread the way. November settled over all of southern Kansas, which was decisively and without apology. The days shortened. The grassland went from brown to a particular pale gold that was almost beautiful if you were not the one responsible for the cattle grazing on it. The hands worked longer hours, bringing the herd to the winter pastures and checking the fence lines and laying in the last of the hay, and Jo's kitchen became the gravitational center of the operation in the way that a good kitchen always does the place where men came not just for food, but for the experience of being in a room that was warm and smelled right and was governed by someone who expected something decent of them. She made soup on the cold days, thick with whatever the larder offered, and the hands ate it standing up at the counter when the work kept them from sitting down properly. And Jo let them do it without comment because she understood the difference between a rule about how things should be done and a rule about what mattered, and she had always been better than most at knowing which was which. The arguing with Calhoun continued. It had developed over the course of October and into November, from the specific practical disputes of the early weeks into something harder to categorize. They argued about the apple trees and the horse and his sleeping habits. Yes, and also about the broader question of how a ranch this size should be managed going forward, and about the contract renewal terms he was considering with a cattle broker in Wichita, and about the particular stubbornness of a man who could run 4,000 acres of Kansas grassland without error and then refuse to acknowledge an obvious inefficiency in the way he organized his supply orders. He was wrong about the supply orders, and she proved it with the account books, laying out 3 months of unnecessary costs in her clear, precise figures, and he looked at them for a long time, and then said nothing, and changed the ordering system the following week without acknowledging that he had done so. She let that stand. Some victories were better won quietly. What she could not let stand, and what she returned to more than once in the long November evenings after the supper dishes were cleared and Calhoun sat at the table with his coffee going cold, was the question of what they were doing. Not in any complicated sense. In the simplest possible sense. They were two people who had arranged their days around each other's presence without anyone deciding to do that, and the arrangement had become in the way of arrangements that develop organically and without deliberation. Something that neither of them had built deliberately, but that both of them had come to rely on, and reliance of that kind had implications that she was not prepared to be careless about. She was not careless about anything. It was the one guarantee she could make about herself. It was a Tuesday evening in November, when the thing that had been building since September finally moved. Joe was tired. It was a specific tiredness, the kind that comes not from hard work, but from the long, cumulative weight of keeping yourself exactly right for 2.5 years, of holding your back straight when your back wanted to bend, of maintaining with exact and unrelenting precision the posture of a woman who needed nothing from anyone and was entirely at peace with that condition. She was tired of eating in the kitchen. It was a small thing. It was a practical thing. The kitchen was cold in November, and the main room had a better fire and a table that seated 14, and which currently held exactly one person at its far end, eating in the silence of a man who had been eating alone for 11 years and had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a sound after long enough. The principle that the cook did not sit at the employer's table was a real principle, and one she had held to without difficulty for 2 months. She had held to it the way she held all her principles, which was absolutely and without exception, because the small disciplines held the larger ones together. But tonight, the principle felt like one more thing that had been handed to her by a world that did not have her interests particularly at heart, and she was tired enough to examine whether she actually needed to keep it. She did not, she concluded, actually need to keep it. She picked up her plate. She walked to the main room. She sat down across from Calhoun Briggs at the long table, set her plate down, and began to eat. She did not explain. She did not apologize. She simply sat down and ate with the same straightforward absence of ceremony, with which she did everything because the decision had been made and decoration would only have weakened it. Calhoun looked up from his plate. He looked at her. He looked back at his plate. Then he looked at her again, and something moved behind his face that had not moved there in a long time. Something that had to do with 11 years of suppers at the head of a long table and the particular weight of all that accumulated silence. He looked down at his food. "Sit there from now on," he said. His voice was rough and low and had nothing ornamental about it. They ate the rest of the meal without speaking. It was the best supper either of them had eaten in years, though neither said so and neither needed to. After that evening, Joe ate at the main table. No further discussion was required or offered. It was simply the arrangement, because both of them had decided it was the arrangement, and decisions made by two people who understood each other did not require extensive commentary. The crew noticed. The crew said nothing, with the particular disciplined silence of 12 men who understood that some things were above their level and that Tatum, who had views on the subject, had communicated those views with enough clarity that elaboration was unnecessary. Tatum's view, expressed once and not repeated, was this: "It's about time." It was 3 nights after the change at the table that Calhoun told her about Margaret. He did not plan to. Joe could see that plainly. She was at the range checking the bread, which was the last task of the evening, and he was at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and he had been sitting there for 20 minutes in a silence that was different from his usual silence, which was the silence of a man thinking about what needed doing. This was the silence of a man thinking about something that could not be done. She did not prompt him. She checked the bread and turned the loaves and put them back and waited. He told her about Margaret. He told her about the 3rd year of their marriage, which had been a good year in every other way. A good year for the spread, and a good spring and a summer that had produced everything it promised. He told her about the birth which had gone wrong, in the way that such things go wrong when everything goes wrong at once, without warning and without remedy, and without the possibility of going back to the moment before. He told her about the child, a boy, who had not survived the week. He told her about 11 years at the head of a long table. He did not ask her to feel anything about it. He said it the way a man says a true thing he has been carrying a long time, not to be relieved of it, but because he had finally arrived at a place where it could be said aloud, and he was not sure he had been in such a place before. Joe finished with the bread. She crossed to the table. She picked up his cup, took it to the range, poured it out, and poured fresh coffee. She set it in front of him and sat back down across from him. She did not say she was sorry. She did not say she understood. She did not offer him the soft words that people reached for at moments like this, the words that were well-meant and inadequate, and that she had received in great quantities after Edmund died and had found almost entirely useless. She sat across from him at the long table in the lamplight and was present, which was the thing she had to offer, and which was, She had found the thing that was most often needed and least often given. Calhoun looked at his fresh coffee. Then he looked at her. Something in his face shifted by the smallest possible degree towards something that was not peace exactly, but was adjacent to it. "You lost your husband 2 years back," he said. 2.5. "I heard about it. Part of it." He paused. "I'd rather hear it from you." She told him about Edmund. She told him the things she had told no one else, not because they were secrets, but because no one else had asked directly, and she had not offered them because Joe Marsh did not trade in her own misfortune and never had. She told him about Edmund's honesty and about what it had cost him. She told him about the books and the partner, and the 2 weeks between the discovery and the death, which had been the 2 worst weeks of her life, and which she had survived by deciding on approximately the 4th day that she was going to survive them. She told him about the table the creditors carried out. She told him about the china, about the house, about the morning she had stood in a hallway that was already someone else's hallway and understood that everything she could see was already gone. And then she told him about Hargrove Webb. This was the part she had not said aloud before, not to anyone, not in 2.5 years. Not the bare facts of it, which the county knew, but the particular specific fact of standing at her bread basket on Main Street every morning, knowing that Webb's sign was 2 blocks behind her left shoulder, that the man who had taken everything was operating 20 yards from where she stood selling bread to people who felt sorry for her. Calhoun listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer the comments that people offered when partial versions of this story escaped into the world, the comments about moving forward and time healing and God's plan, all of which she had found across repeated exposure to be true in the long run and entirely unhelpful in the immediate moment. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. "I know who Webb is," he said finally. "I've done business near him, not with him." A pause that had weight in it. "I know the kind." That was all he said. Joe nodded. She stood, carried her cup to the basin, rinsed it, set it on the shelf. "Good night, Mr. Briggs." "Good night, Mrs. Marsh." She walked down the hall to her room and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a few minutes, not thinking anything in particular, feeling the specific texture of an evening that had changed something without breaking anything, which was the best kind of change and the rarest. The next morning, Calhoun rode into town. Joe saw him leave from the kitchen window earlier than his usual Thursday supply run without any of the hands and without the wagon. She watched him ride down the track toward Caldwell and returned to her work because she had not asked him anything and he had not offered anything, and the boundary of what was hers to know was clear as it always was. He came back 4 hours later. He unsaddled his horse, put her up, and came in for the midday meal without comment. But Joe had seen him from the kitchen window at the moment he turned onto Main Street in the distance. She had seen the direction he rode, which was not toward the bank or the feed store or any of the places a rancher went on a morning errand. It was toward the block where Webb and Associates had its offices. He had not gone inside. He had stopped his horse across the street and sat there looking at the sign, the way a man looks at something he is deciding what to think about. And then he had turned and ridden 2 blocks further to a low building with the word Hollis painted in plain letters above the door, which was the office of a banker named Elias Hollis, a careful and methodical man who had done business with the Briggs spread for 15 years and who had, it was known, a long memory for commercial transactions and a particular interest in the integrity of Caldwell's commercial record. He had gone in. He had come out 40 minutes later. He had ridden to the bank and done whatever business had actually brought him to town, and then he had come home. Joe turned back to her bread. She did not thank him. She had taught him from the first day on the boardwalk what she did with thanks. And the lesson held even now, even for this. Even when the thing he had done was ride to town on a November morning and sit across the street from her enemy, and then go speak quietly to a careful man with a long memory. But that evening she made the spiced cakes. She made them with the care she saved for occasions, the small fragrant ones that had once been the crowning feature of the finest table in 3 counties, and she set one at Calhoun's place without remark. He ate it in silence. But his eyes, when he looked up from the plate, held something that had not been there before, or perhaps had been there for a while, and was only now visible the way certain things only become visible in certain light. Neither of them said a word about it. They were both people who understood that some things were better built than announced. December came in the way. Good December days came in Kansas with a sky like stretched blue canvas and frost on the grass that caught the morning light and threw it back in pieces. The spread was ready for winter. The hay was in the cattle on the south pasture, the kitchen garden put to bed under straw, and the larder stocked to Joe's specifications, which meant it was stocked well. The 14th arrived the way significant days always arrived, with the particular quality of a morning that looked exactly like every other morning and was not. Joe had one good dress. It was dark blue wool, well made in the original, which had been 8 years ago when blue wool had seemed like a reasonable expense for the wife of a prospering merchant. It had been altered twice since then, and it showed the history of those alterations in ways that a trained eye would see. Joe had a trained eye, and she saw them. She put the dress on anyway because it was the dress she had, and it was honest, and she was not going to Dorothea Ashworth's gathering under false colors any more than she had ever done anything else under false colors. She did her hair simply. She had no jewelry. She had owned good jewelry once, and it had gone with everything else, and she did not feel the loss of it tonight, because jewelry was decoration, and she had never needed decoration to feel like herself. She looked in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked like what she was. A woman of 32 who had worked hard for 2.5 years and who was going to walk into a room full of people who knew her history and hold exactly the position she had always held, which was upright. She went out to the wagon where Calhoun was waiting. He had dressed in his good coat and had his hat in his hands, and he looked at her when she came out of the house with the particular directness he had always used with her, as though he was simply confirming something he already knew. He helped her up to the wagon seat without making it a ceremony. They drove to Caldwell in the cold, clear dark, mostly in silence. Dorothea Ashworth's house was the largest on the north end of Caldwell's best street. A 4-square frame house with a parlor that ran the full front width of the building and which could accommodate, on social occasions, a considerable portion of the county's opinion-forming class. It was lit from every window when they arrived, warm yellow light spilling across the frozen ground, and the sound of conversation carried clearly in the still winter air. Joe stepped down from the wagon. She took a breath of cold air that tasted like frost and chimney smoke, and she walked through the front door of Dorothea Ashworth's house with the same step she used for everything, which was forward and without apology. The room was full. Every significant family in the county was represented. The bankers and the merchants and the larger ranch operators and their wives gathered in the particular social formation of a room that understood its own hierarchy and arranged itself accordingly. Heads turned when Joe and Calhoun entered with the unhurried interest of people who had been expecting this entrance and had opinions prepared. Dorothea Ashworth came forward immediately. She was a tall woman, well-dressed in black silk, with a face that had once been handsome and was now something more formidable than handsome. She moved through her own parlor with the authority of a woman who had been the most important person in every room she entered for 30 years and expected no interruption of that arrangement. She took Joe's hands. "My dear Mrs. Marsh," she said, and her voice carried the specific warmth of a woman who had learned warmth as a technique rather than a disposition. "How very good of you to come. We have all been so curious about the woman who has managed to keep Calhoun's kitchen running. It is no small feat, as anyone who has known him will tell you." Light laughter from the nearby guests. "I am pleased to be here, Mrs. Ashworth," Joe said. "You keep a fine house." It was a true statement that committed her to nothing, and Dorothea received it with the smile of a woman who recognized she had not landed the first blow she intended and was adjusting. The evening moved forward. There was food which Joe assessed professionally and found competent. There were conversations which she navigated with the skill of a woman who had hosted her share of them. She was aware of Calhoun beside her or near her throughout the room, his eyes moving to her with a regularity that she noticed and that others noticed, and that was itself a kind of statement. It was at the midpoint of the evening when the room had warmed and the conversation had loosened and the social arrangements had settled into their established positions that Dorothea Ashworth made her move. She did it beautifully. That was the thing Joe would remember afterward, the craft of it, the way a woman who had been doing this for 30 years could make devastation look like hospitality. She gathered a small group near the fire. 6 or 8 of the room's most influential women arranged it so that Joe was within the circle and unable to withdraw, without the withdrawal itself becoming a statement, and she began with sympathy. "I was saying to Mrs. Fenwick just recently," Dorothea began her voice, carrying the gentle projecting quality of a woman who had learned to be heard without appearing to raise her voice, "how remarkable it is that Mrs. Marsh has managed so well. After the difficulties, one does admire the resilience." Murmurs of agreement from the circle. "I remember those wonderful dinners, of course. We all do. Such a table." She glanced at Joe with fond recollection. It is a particular cruelty when circumstances overturn what one has worked so hard to build. A pause of exactly the right length. "But then I suppose one finds other arrangements?" The room was listening now. The room had been listening from the first sentence. "One does worry," Dorothea continued. And here she let something gentle and concerned enter her voice, something that was the precise texture of sincere compassion and was nothing of the kind. About a woman in reduced circumstances, the vulnerabilities. A lonely man can be so very generous, and a woman who has lost her footing can mistake generosity for something more lasting. She looked at Joe with an expression of careful, constructed sympathy. "I say this only with the greatest affection for Calhoun. He is family to me. I would not see him taken advantage of." The room did not breathe. Joe stood inside the silence. She felt it the way you feel the moment before weather breaks the specific pressure of air before the storm commits. She felt the eyes of every person in that circle, and beyond it, waiting for her to do one of the 2 things a cornered woman did: weep or bluster. She did neither. She set down her cup with the care of a woman setting down something she no longer needed, and she turned to face Dorothea Ashworth with a directness that was not aggressive and was not yielding, and was simply the directness of a woman who had decided that the truth was the only instrument she had ever found reliable and intended to use it now. "How kind of you to remember the dinners, Mrs. Ashworth," she said. Her voice was clear and unhurried, and carried to every corner of the room, which was all of it. "You came to a good many of them. I remember you were particularly fond of the spiced cakes." A beat. Natural, not theatrical. Losing the table taught me something I would not otherwise have learned. It showed me the difference between people who valued what I could provide and people who valued me. Those 2 groups turned out to be less alike than I had assumed. She held Dorothea's gaze with the steady patience of someone who has time. The first group stopped calling within a week of the creditors. The second group turned out to be a rancher who cannot say a soft word without doing himself an injury, and 12 working men who wash their hands before supper because someone in that kitchen expects it of them. I would not trade one of them for the whole of the first group assembled. She let that sit for a moment in the silent room. As for being a vulnerability to Mr. Briggs, I have not taken a single thing from that man that he did not negotiate for and pay the fair market price of. I cook 3 meals a day. He pays the agreed wage. I keep his books clean. He pays the additional agreed rate. I tell him the truth about his operation when I see something worth telling, and he applies it. That is the complete arrangement, and every term of it is one I established." She paused. "If there is someone in this room who has given him better value for money, I would be genuinely interested to know it." The room was absolutely still. "You are worried I have taken advantage of a lonely man. Set your mind at ease. The loneliness in that house was 11 years old when I arrived, and what I have provided is 3 meals a day and honest conversation, which are things I would provide any decent person, and which are, as far as I am aware, still legal to provide." She picked up her cup again. "I made the spiced cakes for tonight's table myself. They're by the window. You always loved them, Mrs. Ashworth. Have one for old time's sake." The room remained still for one long moment. And then Calhoun Briggs moved. He had been standing 12 feet away at the edge of the circle, and he had heard every word, and his face had gone through a series of changes during the course of Joe's address that began with the particular rigidity of a man controlling his expression, and ended with something that was not controlled at all. He set his glass down. He crossed the room. He came to stand beside Jo, not behind her, not in front of her, but beside her, shoulder to shoulder, facing Dorothea Ashworth and the assembled room. "Dorothea," he said. His voice was low and even and had the quality of a man who has decided that not saying a thing is no longer acceptable. "You have run the question of who's anybody in this county for a long time. I've let you because I didn't care enough to stop you." He paused. "I care now." He did not look at Dorothea again after that. He turned to Jo. The room watched Calhoun Briggs turn his back on his late wife's sister and the assembled social authority of Caldwell, Kansas. And it understood what it was watching. "I had something prepared," he said, and his voice had lost its public quality and was directed entirely at her, which meant the room heard it anyway, because the room was silent as January. "For a quieter night than this. I'm no good at speeches, and you would only find the errors in it." Jo looked at him. Her face was composed, her spine was straight, her hands were steady. "So I'll say it plainly," Calhoun said. "I offered you a kitchen in September, and you corrected me on the terms, and you were right to, and I have been trying since then to figure out how to offer you the rest of it in terms you would not correct. I have not found a way to do that because you are more particular about terms than anyone I have ever dealt with, and I find I respect that too much to work around it." He was not a man for decoration. The plainness and the accuracy of what he said was what made the room understand that this was not a performance. "Marry me, Josephine. Not as my cook and not as a woman I am doing a kindness for, and not as anything except the equal you have been at that table since the night you sat down at it. I will spend the rest of my life being told off by the most honest woman in Kansas, and I will count myself the better for it every single day." Jo stood in the bright, warm room where she had been brought to be undone. She stood in the dress that had been altered twice and carried the history of 2 hard years in its seam. She stood without jewelry and without the table that had been carried out the door and without the name that had been declared worthless by a creditor's court. She stood with the one thing she had kept through all of it, the thing they had not found in the inventory, because it was not the kind of thing that appeared in inventories. She stood upright, and she discovered in that moment something she had not expected to discover, that her pride and her happiness were not as she had long believed them to be enemies, that they could occupy the same moment, that a woman could be entirely unbendingly herself and also be offered something worth having by a man who had the particular wisdom to understand that her unbendingness was not an obstacle, but the whole point. "You understand," she said, "that you will not win an argument in that house. Not one. Not ever." "I'm counting on it," Calhoun said. "Then, yes," said Jo. "Yes." She let a beat pass because she was who she was. "And Mrs. Ashworth is right that I make the best spiced cakes in 3 counties. We'll have them at the wedding." The room breathed again. It breathed with the particular quality of a room that has watched something it will be talking about for years, something that has shifted the arrangements of things in ways that will take time to fully understand. Several women in the circle near the fire found they were wiping their eyes. Several of the men found they were grinning in a way they would have denied if challenged. Dorothea Ashworth stood in her own parlor and found herself in the unprecedented position of being on the wrong side of her own gathering, outmaneuvered not by aggression or cunning, but by the simple direct application of truth in a room full of people who had been waiting without knowing they were waiting to hear exactly that. She said nothing further. There was nothing further to say. They drove home from Dorothea Ashworth's gathering in the same silence they had driven there in, which was the same silence they used for everything, but with a different quality to it now. The way the same road looks different going home than it did going out. The cold was serious, and the stars were clear, and the horse knew the way without guidance, which was fortunate because Calhoun had not yet said anything, and Jo had not yet said anything, and neither of them appeared to be in a rush to change that, because some things were better settled first, before they were spoken about, and what had happened in that parlor was still settling. It was Jo who finally spoke somewhere past the edge of town, with the Briggs Spreads track visible in the distance ahead. "I'll want to look at the terms," she said. Calhoun turned to look at her in the dark. "The terms," he repeated, "of the arrangement. I want them clear before we go any further. I will not have us proceeding on assumptions." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, there was something in his voice that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to it. "You want to negotiate the terms of a marriage proposal? I want to be clear about what we each understand we're agreeing to. That's not negotiation. That's due diligence." He drove in silence for a moment. "All right," he said. "What are your terms?" "I keep the books. I keep the kitchen as I run it. I tell you the truth about the operation when I see something worth telling, and you apply it without argument. We eat at the same table." A pause. "I keep my name alongside yours, not replaced by it. Josephine Marsh Briggs." Calhoun nodded once. "Those are fair terms. And you stop losing arguments deliberately, so I'll keep arguing with you. I noticed that in October." The silence that followed this was longer than the others. "I don't know what you're talking about," Calhoun said. "Yes, you do." He drove. The horse's hooves were steady on the frozen ground. "Those are my terms," he said eventually. "I accept yours." Joe looked straight ahead at the track unfolding in the lamplight. "Then we're agreed." "We are." They arrived at the Briggs spread, and he helped her down from the wagon with the same unhurried steadiness he brought to everything. And they went inside, and the kitchen was still warm from the evening fire, and neither of them said anything further about it that night, because the thing was decided, and decided things did not require elaboration. But Joe, lying in her room in the dark with the cold pressing against the window glass, thought about terms and what they meant, and about the particular courage of a man who had offered her a partnership in a room full of people and had done it without decoration, and she thought that whatever else the coming years held, she was unlikely to be bored. She closed her eyes and slept better than she had in 2.5 years. They were married in January. The ceremony was held at the Methodist Church on Caldwell's Main Street on a Saturday morning, when the sky was the color of old pewter, and the cold was serious and honest about itself. Reverend Albright, who had known both of them separately for years, performed the service with the economy of a man who understood that these two particular people had already said the essential things and did not need him to say them again at length. The church was fuller than either of them had anticipated. Caldwell had, in the weeks between the Ashworth gathering and the wedding, undergone a shift in its social arrangements that was quiet and thorough and could not have been predicted by anyone who had not been paying close attention to the room on December the 14th. The county had watched Calhoun Briggs turn his back on Dorothea Ashworth's parlor, and it had drawn its conclusions, and its conclusions were on the whole favorable to Joe. Several women who had bought her bread with a soft, pitying look came to the wedding. They did not look at her with pity now. They looked at her with the particular expression of people who have watched someone handle something difficult with grace, and have revised their opinion accordingly, which is one of the rarer and more valuable things a human face can do. The 12 hands came, all 12 of them without being asked, which was itself a statement about the kind of cook Joe was and the kind of men she had made of them, or perhaps restored to them, which was closer to the truth. They appeared at the back of the church in their good clothes, which for most of them meant their least worn work clothes, brushed clean and supplemented in several cases by collars borrowed from other men, and they stood in a row at the back like fence posts in an unusual display of uprightness, large and scrubbed and serious. Tatum stood at the end of the row nearest the door. He had polished his boots to a standard that suggested significant effort. He stood with the posture of a man who had decided this occasion deserved something better from him than his usual posture, and was working hard to provide it. Halfway through the ceremony, when Joe spoke her part in the clear, direct voice she used for everything, Tatum looked at the ceiling with sudden, intense interest. He maintained this interest in the ceiling for approximately 45 seconds. Later, 3 different hands told 3 different other hands that Tatum had definitely not cried. Tatum himself said nothing on the subject, which was his right and which no one challenged. Reverend Albright pronounced them husband and wife with the particular satisfaction of a man who has watched something arrive at its proper conclusion, and Calhoun Briggs kissed his wife with the same direct, unhurried attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. And the room responded with the warmth of people who had come hoping for exactly this and were not disappointed. Dorothea Ashworth did not attend. Her absence was noted and then moved past with the dispatch that the occasion deserved. After the ceremony, in the brief cold hour before the wedding supper, Jo stood in the vestibule of the church with Calhoun beside her, receiving the hands as they filed past with their careful handshakes and their brief, genuine congratulations. Tatum came last. He took her hand in both of his, which was not a gesture she had expected from him and which she received without comment. "You're good for him," Tatum said. "You're good for the whole outfit." He paused, looking for the next words, which did not come easily to a man who used his carefully. "You're the reason I wash my hands." Jo looked at him. "You were going to wash them eventually." "Probably not," Tatum said with complete honesty. She allowed herself a small, genuine smile, which was rarer than her pleasant expression and meant considerably more. He went out into the cold and Jo stood in the vestibule of the church, watching the last of 12 pairs of boots disappear through the door into the January morning. And she felt the weight of the past 2.5 years in her chest. Not as grief, not any more. As the particular density of time that has been survived and has in the surviving become something other than loss. Something that had weight and substance and could be carried without being crushed by it. She straightened the cuff of her dress and went out to her wedding supper. The Webb matter resolved itself in February. The sequence of events was this. In November, Calhoun had gone to the office of Elias Hollis, who had handled the Briggs Spreads banking needs for 15 years and who had, alongside a reputation for careful dealing, a long and specific memory for commercial transactions in Caldwell and the surrounding territory. Hollis was a spare, precise man of 60 who had seen enough of commerce to know the difference between bad luck and bad faith, and who had over 2 years held certain observations about the collapse of Edmund Marsh's concern in the particular compartment of his mind, where he kept things that had not yet resolved themselves but had not been forgotten. Calhoun had not accused anyone of anything. He had not presented evidence because he did not have evidence. He had described in the careful, factual language he used for business certain things he had come to understand about the Marsh concern's final years and certain patterns he had noticed in Webb's subsequent commercial dealings. And he had left it to Hollis to determine what to do with the information, which was the only thing he could properly do. Hollis had listened. He had asked 3 questions, each more specific than the last, and Calhoun had answered them. Then Hollis had thanked him for his time, and they had discussed ranch business for 20 minutes, and Calhoun had gone home. What Hollis did with the information was this. He wrote a letter to a creditors group in Wichita that had been owed money by the Marsh concern and that had, at low intensity and without notable progress, been examining the transaction records for 2 years. The letter described certain observations framed as questions that shifted the angle from which those records had been examined. It was a short letter and a precise one, which was the only kind Hollis wrote, and it arrived in Wichita the 3rd week of November. The creditors group had a careful man of their own. A compact, methodical attorney named Fessler, who had been looking at the Marsh records long enough to know them the way you know a thing you have been living with, which is to say in the way that allows you to notice when something has changed about it. What Hollis's letter changed was the direction of looking, and when Fessler looked from the new direction, certain things that had not been visible became visible. He wrote to Hollis. Hollis wrote back. By the time Jo and Calhoun were being married at the Methodist Church on the 2nd Saturday of January, Fessler was in possession of a set of observations that taken together constituted not evidence, but the shape of where evidence might be found. In February, a formal inquiry was opened. Jo learned about it from the Caldwell newspaper on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of February. She was at the kitchen table of the Briggs house, which was her house now, with her coffee and the paper. She turned the page and saw the notice in the commercial section, 3 inches of type in the formal language of inquiry proceedings, and she read it through once. Then she set the paper flat on the table with both hands and looked at it. Calhoun was in the barn. The kitchen was quiet around her. The fire ticked in the range, and the coffee steamed, and outside the window the February light was pale and clean across the frost-covered grass. She read the notice again. She thought about Edmund. She thought about him the way she had learned to think about him over 2.5 years, not with the raw grief of the first months, not with the anger that had come after the clean cold, anger that had kept her upright when grief would have folded her, but with something quieter now. Something that was closer to the way you carry a person you have loved. Present but not crushing, there and not unbearable. Edmund had trusted the wrong man because he was the kind of man who trusted. That had been his nature, and it had cost him everything. And she had spent 2.5 years working out whether to mourn it or be proud of it. And she had arrived somewhere in the long Kansas winter at the conclusion that it was both. That a man could be destroyed by his own decency, and that his decency could still be the best thing about him. That those two facts could be true at once and did not cancel each other. She thought about the table, not with grief, with something that surprised her still when she noticed it, which was something close to gratitude. The table was gone. The china was gone. The name as she had carried it was in the process of becoming something new, not lesser, not greater, just different, built on different ground. And in the losing of all of it, she had found the thing the creditors could not itemize, and she had found the man who had ridden to town on a November morning to sit across the street from a sign that had no right to be standing, and she had found that she was capable of more than she had known, which was the only discovery that ever truly mattered. Hargrove Webb would answer for what he had done, not to her, not by her hand, and not by Calhoun's. The law would do what the law did slowly and imperfectly and without the satisfying clarity of a story that resolves itself completely, because justice in the actual world was never as clean as justice in the stories people told about it. It would not bring Edmund back. It would not restore the table or the china or the 2 years on the boardwalk. It would not undo the morning she had stood with a bread basket on Main Street and known that the sign was 2 blocks behind her left shoulder. But it would correct the record. It would state in the careful, formal language of a commercial inquiry that Edmund Marsh had been an honest man who had been defrauded, which was the truth and which had not been the official truth, for 2.5 years, and which mattered to Jo in a way she could not have explained to anyone who had not spent 2.5 years knowing a thing was true and watching the world proceed as though it were not. The record would be corrected. She was done asking for more than that. She folded the newspaper. She thought about the mornings she had not looked at the sign. All those mornings, one after another, with the sign at her left shoulder and her back straight and her bread arranged and her 5-cent coins returned to the women who had offered them with soft eyes. All those mornings, when the discipline had been the thing that held her together, the small rules that kept the larger ones intact. She did not need to keep that particular rule anymore. She thought for the first time in 2.5 years about what Main Street would look like when the sign came down. She thought about it with the calm, specific attention she gave to things she had decided about. The sign would come down. The inquiry would proceed at whatever pace inquiries proceeded. Webb would account for what he had done in whatever form that accounting took. She would not be there to see it happen, and she did not need to be. She was here, in this kitchen, in this house. With bread rising on the sideboard and a man in the barn who had ridden to town on a November morning for reasons he had never explained and never needed to. The kitchen door opened and Calhoun came in, stamping the frost from his boots. He looked at her face, then at the newspaper on the table. He could read her face the way she could read ledger pages now, with the accumulated fluency of months of close attention, and he knew from what he saw what was in the paper before he read a word of it. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. She slid the newspaper across the table. He read it. He set it down. He looked at his coffee for a moment. "Hollis is a careful man," he said. That was all he said. And it was enough because it was true and because they were both people who understood that a true sentence said once was worth more than 100 that circled around the truth without landing on it. Jo looked at him across the table. She looked at the man who had gone into town on a November morning and done a quiet, specific thing without being asked and without telling her and without any expectation that it would produce a result within any predictable time frame because it was the right thing to do and it was within his reach. And those were the only 2 conditions he required. "Thank you," she said. He looked up at her. In the months she had known him, she had not said those words to him in this way. She had returned the overpaid coins and refused the offered charity and declined his thanks and not offered her own because they had built their arrangement on the principle of fair exchange and honest terms and the mutual recognition that neither of them was doing the other a kindness but only what was right. She said it now because the terms had changed. Because he was her husband, and this was her house, and she was sitting at her own table, and because the thing he had done was not a transaction, but a choice made quietly on behalf of the truth, without the expectation of credit. She said it once plainly because once was enough when you meant it. Calhoun looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face, the small, unperformed shift of a man arriving somewhere he had been traveling toward, without knowing it. "You're welcome, Josephine," he said. They sat at the table in the February morning light and drank their coffee, and outside the window the frost on the grass was beginning to soften at the edges where the sun reached it, which was the first evidence, tentative and small, that winter had an end coming. The bread on the sideboard was rising. In a few minutes the hands would come in from the morning work, stomping their boots on the step, calling for breakfast, and the kitchen would fill with the ordinary, sustaining noise of a day beginning properly. And Joe would feed them the way she had fed them since September, with exact attention and without sentiment, and with the unspoken expectation that they were capable of sitting at a civilized table, which they were. Tatum would come in last, as he always did, and he would call her ma'am, as he always did, and there would be nothing remarkable about the morning at all, which was the best possible thing a morning could be. The sign on Main Street came down in March. Joe was not in town when it happened. She was at the Briggs spread at the range making the morning bread. She heard about it from the newspaper 3 days later, a brief notice in the commercial section stating that Webb and Associates had suspended operations pending the conclusion of the formal inquiry and that the offices on Main Street had been vacated. She read the notice once. Then she set the paper aside and checked the bread, which was ready, and took it from the oven and set it on the rack to cool and called the hands in for the morning meal. She did not think about the sign again that day. She had no need to. The sign had stood at her left shoulder for 2.5 years and had been in its way a discipline, a thing she had trained herself not to look at, a small daily practice of keeping her attention on what was in front of her rather than on what had been done to her. She was grateful for that practice now in the way you are grateful for difficult training when you understand what it prepared you for. The record was being corrected. Edmund's name would stand in the correct light eventually when the inquiry concluded and the findings were published. Not vindication exactly, not the clean satisfaction of a story with a clear ending, but correction, which was the thing that was actually available and which she had learned across 2.5 years of living in the real world, rather than the world of clean endings, to value for what it was rather than what it was not. That was enough. In April, Fessler, the attorney, wrote to Joe directly. The letter was formal and careful and precise in the way that Hollis's communications were precise, which suggested the two men had compared their approaches. It informed her that the inquiry had established with sufficient clarity the broad outline of what had occurred in the final years of Edmund Marsh's commercial concern. It informed her that certain findings would be entered into the official commercial record. It informed her that her husband's reputation as a man of business would be formally and publicly restored. Joe read the letter at the kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the small wooden box where she kept the things that mattered. The recipe book with her mother's handwriting. The deed to the Briggs spread with her name alongside Calhoun's. The letter Edmund had written to her from the Wichita Hotel on one of his buying trips, short and plain and exactly true. She put Fessler's letter in the box and closed the lid, and put the box back on the shelf above the writing desk. She went back to the range. The spring came on fast and warm that year, the way Kansas springs could when they decided to arrive, and the Briggs spread came alive with the particular productive energy of a ranch that had wintered well and was ready for the new season. The hands worked long and hard, and ate long and hard, and lived up to the standard that had been established the previous fall and that had become without formal discussion simply the standard of the outfit. They washed before meals. They scraped their boots. They called Joe ma'am with the inflection that meant something, and they moved through the kitchen with the ease of men who knew they were welcome there and were not inclined to abuse the welcome. Tatum had become over the winter something that no one had predicted he would become, which was a reliable presence. He had always been reliable in the technical sense, in the sense of doing the work and doing it correctly, but there was a difference between reliable and present, and he had become present, which was the thing Joe had watched for, and which when it came was as quiet and certain as everything else on that spread. He came to her one evening in April with a question about a letter he had received, which was from a woman in Abilene he had been corresponding with. He was not a man who asked for help with personal matters, and the asking itself was the significant thing. Joe read the letter and told him it was a sincere letter from a woman who was asking a direct question and deserved a direct answer. Tatum considered this. He asked what the direct answer was. Joe looked at him for a moment. "You already know what the direct answer is, Tatum. You came here because you wanted someone to tell you it was all right to say it." He thought about that. "Is it?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "It is." He wrote the letter. The woman wrote back. That was the beginning of something, though it proceeded at the pace that such things proceed at when both people are serious about them, which is slowly and with care and without rushing toward a conclusion before the foundation is properly laid. Joe watched it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who recognizes a pattern she knows well. Calhoun found her one evening in late April, standing at the kitchen window looking out at the spread in the last of the evening light. She was not thinking about anything particular. She was simply looking at the land, at the 4,000 acres that were hers, now as much as his, at the grass, coming green in the low places along the creek, and the cattle moving in the south pasture, and the barn that needed new board on the east face, and the fence line that ran straight and true to the horizon. She realized, looking at it the way Calhoun looked at it, with the comprehensive proprietary attention of a person who has decided that this place is theirs to care for. He came to stand beside her. They stood at the window in the evening quiet and looked at what was theirs side by side at the same height, because that was the only arrangement either of them had ever been comfortable with. "We need to talk about the summer pasture rotation," Joe said. "I know," Calhoun said. "You're doing it wrong. I suspected you'd have a view on that. I have the account figures. I'll show you after supper." He was quiet for a moment. "Josephine," he said. She turned to look at him. He did not say anything further for a moment in the way of a man who has something to say, and is determining the right way to say it, which for him meant the plainest way. "I want you to know," he said, "that this is the best year I've had in 11 years. She looked at him. "The apple butter helped," she said. Something happened in his face that was for Calhoun Briggs a very large thing, and which anyone watching who did not know him well would have missed entirely, because it was small in the way that genuine things are often small. He almost smiled. "The apple butter," he agreed. They stood at the window a moment longer, looking at the land going gold in the last of the April evening, at the work they had built and the work that remained, and the long, specific future of it spreading out in every direction they cared to look. That was the story of Josephine Marsh, who lost a fine table and a good name and nearly everything the world had agreed to assign value to, and who kept the one thing that had not appeared on any inventory and could not be carried out any door by any creditor in the history of creditors' courts. She kept herself, and in keeping herself precisely and without compromise, through 2.5 years of bread baskets and returned coins and straight-backed mornings on a boardwalk with a sign at her left shoulder that she refused to look at. She had arrived at a kitchen that was hers, at a table she sat at as an equal, at a man who had been wise enough on a September morning to take his hat off when she told him she did not need his pity. The bread was rising on the sideboard. The accounts were clean. The land ran straight to the horizon in every direction. And at the long table, in the evening light, a woman with a straight back sat across from a man who lost every argument and came back for more. And neither of them would have traded a single word of it for anything the world had previously seen fit to offer them.